Thank you so much, Hongbing. Indeed, this is coming back home. I want to start with indeed, coming back home, all throughout my intellectual pursuit. And my Stanford professors, especially sociology, because I was a PhD student in sociology department, had a huge influence on me. I will say in particular, the neo-institutional perspective. So my professors, John Mayer, Dick Scott, and Woody Powell, really had a huge influence on me. You will see some of the influence in my talk today, but I also want to say their attitude towards research is really something that probably is even more important, staying with me. I will say, even though I'm in business school, I have to say my mentor, my professor, main advisor, John Mayer, was very disappointed when I accepted a job in the business school after my PhD. He said, why do you go to business school? But I wanted to say, first of all, I have kept the serious research attitude that he has imparted in me, but also I find my sociological training to be very beneficial, actually, to business people. Now that I'm the chair of the Department of Entrepreneurship at INSEAD, I really see how my training, my ability to see the gap between perception and reality, really helps these entrepreneurs because they don't take things for granted. They look for opportunities which reside in the gap between perception and reality. So I say to my professors, I didn't waste your time on me. Seeing Hongbing, I also wanted to mention, I remember the good old days when me and Hongbing and the PhD students in economics and sociology, including the PhD student of Scott, we spent some weekends in Rings, which is a little village, and we gave the name China Rings to our little club. And I remember how we talked about China could be a special case to contribute to theory, because a lot of empirical studies are done in the Western context. And we remember we talk about how we can contribute to the world in China, so indeed, I owe a lot to Stanford, to the community that I grew up in. So I want to come back to my talk. Indeed, this is a hot topic, digital transformation. In fact, my daughter, who is currently a sophomore student here, just recently told me Stanford student, undergrad students to do a lot of in-class exams now, because if you take it home, ChatGPT could. So I see the impact here. But my approach, to digital. So first of all, I use a standard definition of digital transformation. It is using these technologies, the digital technologies, to transform manufacturing, marketing, and other functions like administrative functions. So this is indeed the standard definition. Many companies do this in order to improve efficiency. And it's this precise goal of improving efficiency that made me think more about the driving forces, okay, and about the impact of government policies. So I'll come to that. Indeed, again, my influence from my Stanford training, I take a much more macro perspective to answer this question. As a business school professor, actually, I had to do a lot of my teaching with the more micro perspective. I have to teach my students, my executive students, what are these major hurdles to digital transformation? So in my classes, I have to talk about, and I get to understand more about the hurdles, why that these corporate executives, even though they know the benefits of digital technologies, but they have a hard time actually implementing these in their firm. So they are very concerned about the high risk. After you invested so much in a smart factory, right? What if things don't go right, and what if you do not recoup the benefits in the short run? And their KPIs are based on sometimes even quarterly returns, right? They talk about the lack of infrastructures, lack of capabilities, organizational inertia. So we haven't been doing this for a while, so it's difficult. And then the lack of digital mindset. Some recent publications talk about you actually need a culture of empowerment. So when you still have a very hierarchical structure, it's hard to give people that power, right? Because when people start to use digital technologies, the frontline people gain more power. So all of these are the things that made me think it is hard to do this. Okay? I mean, in my classroom, I had to teach people about this. So then, the natural question is then what drives companies to do this, right? When they are actually doing it. Yes.
Yeah. So if there's a competition, do they have to do this?
So economists will say, if we have a well-functioning market, right, and people are rational, so sooner or later they will recognize. But as an organization person, as someone who deals with management all the time, we cannot just think about the long term. Okay? The market is going to be efficient. However, it's the individuals who are running them. So that's why we still need to understand, given the difficulties, right, what then is driving them, is pushing them. So that's why, I am, interested in policy, the macro aspect. I will say, even though I'm going to talk about China, but I picked this topic not only because, it's relevant in China. If we look up, indeed, the global trend, we see these national policies throughout the world. So in the US, we have the National Strategy for Advanced Manufacturing. In Germany, they use the term Industry 4.0, and some digital policies in EU. So I list some of them, the Digital Europe program and so on. If you look at these programs, indeed, it's a lot of investment from the government. Okay? So for example, this Digital Europe program, it aims to invest in digital infrastructures, and then the goal is, here it says competitiveness, so efficiency is there, green transition, as well as technological sovereignty. So you look at these big numbers of investment, and then in the past 3 years, because of COVID, there is this recovery and resilience plan, and in that plan specifically, for example, it says 20% of the money has to be spent on digital transition. So in France, where I'm currently based on, indeed 21.3% of that money is going to be spent to support business, to do digital education. So this is across the world. So that's why I feel.
So I have a question about So most of these programs that you just said are very interesting. Who makes the decisions? Is it just some government bureaucrat that hands out the money, or people apply, or is there any market? Is there any?
This is a very good question. Right before the talk, I asked Chuck this question. The U.S. Big plan, the chip plan, right? It's a lot of money. How does the government decide which company to give that money? Right. So indeed, we have a lot of field researchers here. Kathy, Scott, I know you spend a lot of time really understanding the processes and details, so numbers do not mean much. Now, I think that's an interesting place, and indeed later on I will show to you in this context which companies are more likely to comply with the policies. So even though it's the same policies, but the government actually has an eye on which companies they're going to push more. So indeed, I think many interesting things happen in that process, in the choosing, in the targeting, in the response process. So I will get there. And I think this probably varies by across countries. That is what kinds of companies got picked to do this. So, but here I wanted to share with you my overarching or my kind of underlying assumption. Indeed, this is the perspective that I have developed over time, and maybe my difference from my mentors that I talked about earlier on, and also from some established literatures. With this perspective, you will understand better why I make some arguments later on. So I want to start with my overarching perspective here. When a lot of people from across disciplines try to understand the role of the state, if we look at these different perspectives, we tend to see a big focus on the unity of the state, which I disagree with, and I will get there. So when I say unity, by the way, this is not talking about political sovereignty. Okay, I know whenever I use this word, it could be misinterpreted. I'm not talking about politically the state is divided, but I'm talking about a perspective that can help us understand better how policies work. Okay, so this is a more academic perspective of the state. So as I look at the field, for example, a very, very important view, the strong state view, I am referring to the literature that tries to explain, for example, the rise of East Asian economies in the 1980s and 90s. So the view is, the state is an autonomous bureaucracy. It's above the interests of various industrial or social groups. That's why it's able to push forward effectively the industrial policies. Okay, so this is a view that has been quite dominant in explaining the rise of the Asia tigers, for example. Why these countries, late industrializing countries, are able to grow so fast. And then if you look at some research, trying to explain the traditional economies like China and Hungary, their view is also inherently kind of the strong state view, right? So, for example, there's a study about Hungary, why the capitalism was able to grow. This is because the state, after transition, was able to very strongly, protect the private interests against, for example, foreign competitive, very competitive capitalists. So this view about the strong state assumes, the state is coherent. They just work together. They have this common goal, and they're able to, make their policies, go through. And then this other literature, at administrative capacity. They look at, what countries, what governments have, better trained bureaucrats, for example, right? Better, stronger rule of law. So countries with stronger administrative capacity are able to push through, for example, corporate governance reform, right? So that literature, I feel, also shares the assumption that the state is quite uniform and, exerts coherent pressures. Even from political science, when political scientists are talking about how state is captured by, by various, voting groups, seemingly kind of opposite view of the strong state, but I feel they also assume the state is pretty homogeneous. It's just in this case, they're weaker and they're captured by these other, social groups. So, our view is, I feel this is a bit too simplistic. Okay, I feel the state is actually quite fragmented in terms of the individual bureaucrats, in terms of different levels of government, in terms of different parties. They actually have quite different concerns and interests in mind. So in my own research, I wanted to share, so I wanted to mention 3 examples how I apply this fragmented view of the state. So for example, in a recent publication, we look at Taiwan, okay, which is a democracy. However, we find, depending on how, to whom corporations are tied with, whether they're tied with politicians in the executive branch, 行政院, or legislative branch, 立法院, okay, and we look at the corporate governance reform. So in this case, the adoption of independent directors in these private companies. We notice that if they have a tie, if they know someone, or if they themselves serve in the executive branch, they're more likely to implement this reform. Okay, but if they know someone or tied closely to the legislative branch, they're much less likely to engage in the corporate governance reform, because legislators feel the obligation to protect them. So they were able to use these legislators to avoid doing things that the administrators want them to do. The background is administrators want them to adopt independent directors in order to attract foreign investment and then grow national economy. Okay, so but when they're tied with these administrative, branch leaders, they are pressured to actually do it because the administrators have a KPI. Okay, they need these corporations to implement their national strategies. So that's how we see the fragmentation at work. And then the second piece, we look at mainland China. The government, the central government, it very much wants the companies to adopt CSR, more CSR, corporate social responsibility kind of activities. Now, we realize, well, the central government of China is much more long-term oriented versus the local, provincial government officials are much more short-term oriented. For example, they're more interested in economic growth rather than environmental protection. So what we discover is companies that are tied to both, okay, are in the middle of this conflicting pressures. And as a result, they will have some symbolic or decoupling behavior. For example, they will issue these CSR reports very fast, but with low quality. Okay? We feel it's a balancing act to both please the central government as well as the local government. And then the third one, we notice how individual bureaucrats, when they are at different stages of their career, they actually have very different concerns. So the ones who are close to retirement are more concerned about social stability, because social stability is one of the important KPIs for them. If they don't, if they're unrest, for example, in their province, they could have a very bad time. So when they are close to retirement, thinking that they might not be able to benefit from their investment in economic growth that much, they pay more attention to these social stability goals. So as a result, we notice provinces that are led by these close to retirement officials will force the private companies in their region to acquire bankrupt companies, bankrupt state-owned companies, versus in provinces where the young leaders, they're still ambitious about their future career, will not do that. So this is how we discover, again, that state is fragmented, and it's not very helpful to only look at one type of policy or the proclaimed goals of the government. Okay, so given my research background, I'm now moving into this project, and I'm being transparent. That's the lens that I still take, to look at this phenomena. So our research question is, how do digital policies affect firm practice given the conflicting demands from the government? So knowing that they might have these conflicting demands, how would these policies work? This is still work in progress. So I apologize I was not able to send you a paper, but I really like to take this opportunity to get your feedback, and whether our findings and our explanations are reasonable. So so the context of this, China indeed is now very much ahead of the game compared with many other countries in this digital space. And indeed, many scholars, many observers attribute this to the government's effort. So, and that's a starting point that really made us, want to understand, how do these policies work? Do they work or not? On which companies do they work more? So indeed, the central government views digitalization as kind of a strategic way to upgrade their industries, and then national economic growth. So this very well known made in China strategy, national strategy. This is about upgrading, like China should no longer be the world factory, the cheap factory, but rather the high end. So if we look at the number of policies at the central government level, it has increased over time. So when I gave some examples. So this one is made in China 5-year plan, and the one at the bottom is the state council, talking about Internet Plus. Okay. So these plans. Now our interest is more at the local government level, because that's where we see a lot of variations. Okay, so some provinces are much more active than others. So what do these provincial level policies do? For example, they talk about building special zones, infrastructures for these digital companies, or it's about subsidies, providing funding. So for example, I gave some example here, and this is, by the way, we coded these provincial level documents. In Sichuan province, this is my home province, the document said they are going to put in $1.89 billion US, which is about 3.8% of the government expenditure. So this money will all be used to subsidize companies that do this digital transformation.
So I have a quick question.
Yes.
Why is the government doing this? What's their underlying? Are they worried about the demography demise? Are they worried about rising wage rates? Are they worried about lack of incoming technology from a more polarized, divided world?
Mm-hmm.
Why do they, why do they want to do that? And then what are the, I guess you've interviewed companies. Why would companies want to do this?
Right.
What are the underlying mechanisms that's driving?
Scott, so indeed, that's the core of our research project. Now, from the government side, I will say it's complicated. I will say it's not just economic rationale, although this is something they talk about most. I think they will talk about upgrading industries, They will talk about efficiency, right? But also the green part, so that there will be more green industries. But it's also definitely for national sovereignty, for being able to do something that will put China in a leadership position. I think political economy explains this much better than classical economics
So
argument.
it's not due to rising wage rates as much as I want to be the top digitalized.
Yes,
company.
yes. I think that's why we feel the government is pushing this even in places, companies or provinces where there is such an obvious lack of immediate need for this. Okay, so that's why we feel from the government side, indeed, it's a mix of motivations, but very important motivations from their perspective. Yeah, from the company's point of view, it's also very interesting. And here I very much kind of adopted, and I find my mentor's explanation quite powerful. I will say it's not just for market competitiveness, although in some cases it does, reduce the labor costs and all that, but it's also for legitimacy. Okay, because once they understand this is something the government really wants to push, right? Doing it will help the companies, be viewed as a legitimate player in the country, not only just for the name of it, but also in terms of getting a lot of government support. Having that endorsement from the government is very, very important for companies operating in a relatively big market economy. Yes.
So are there any KPIs the government can evaluate these companies? And the central government can evaluate the local government?
Yes, yes. So indeed, we think KPIs play a big role. That's why, at one point we put in a variable, which is, the last term for the top government leaders, and we find that variable has a negative effect on corporate digital transformation, meaning, for leaders who are close to retirement, they're less motivated. But for the younger leaders, the KPIs are very clear. They need to do this.
But there's a number they can use to evaluate them, right?
Yes.
But the numbers, how do you?
In fact, thank you for that question. Let me also mention, my collaborators. So for this project, I've been working with actually a research team from Tilly's University. My important collaborators there, Chen Shuangming, who is a professor in that university, as well as Wang Jun, who is a PhD student there. And I want to mention my collaborator, Professor Chen, works with the government to come up with measures of kind of digital transformation corporations. So indeed, this is a government push effort to come up with a standard kind of a KPI to see how digitalized these companies in their jurisdiction have become. So indeed, that's a measurement for top government leaders, work. Yes. Okay. So this is the provincial government. If you look at the variation, so here is a cumulative number of policies because the past policies continue to take an effect. So that's why we look at the cumulative number of policies in different provinces. As you can see, it's growing, over time, but there is indeed important regional differences. So that's why, it gives us an opportunity to test, do these policies actually have an effect? So that's okay. So if you look at the outcome, we have heard a lot of good stories. So indeed, good outcomes. These surveys, most of them I feel are not representative surveys, but they did give us, very kind of a good outcome. So, China has, digital economy has grown so much indeed. And then the Sequoia Capital, which is a private, VC capital, in their survey, they found, 95% of the companies they surveyed actually carried out digital transformation. And then in Tsinghua University, in their Institute of Global Industry, they did a survey, and again they also showed how much percentage of companies have invested heavily in digital transformation. We have heard some exemplary stories. So with Sanyi Zhonggong Sanyi Heavy Industry, this is a private company, by the way. So they built this so-called lighthouse factory. And it's very, very impressive. Okay, if you haven't been there, I strongly recommend it. So you will see it's almost completely automated. So they spend, a lot of money on it, and smart operation. In terms of labor, use of robots. Indeed, a lot of labor saving, basically. Yeah.
Rose, how is that? I mean, I see that there are a lot of robotics, but robotics is fairly old school. So how is this new? How is like blockchain or cloud or something?
Right. Indeed. So, indeed, so our measurement actually, we don't just, later on look at the use of robots. It's very true, robots is kind of the early stage, but now the government really wanted everything to be automated. Blockchain and all this, and not only in this factory, but the whole ecosystem. So it's a much deeper, to substantive use of this digital technologies. Yes, and it's not just one spot, but it should be kind of a systematized way of using digital technology. Yeah, in this factory, I will say, not only are there robots, they indeed have used digital technologies in a very systematic way. So, yeah.
In the previous slide before this one, you had some number, or the one before this. Yeah, so you had the digital economy reach 45.5 trillion. Or does that include some amount that is basically spent on surveillance, that is digital surveillance as part of the digitalization? And
Yes.
I know that the United States government, for example, with certain products, they require a back door so that you could go in and do something if the government wanted you to do it for them.
Yes. So some people say, indeed, going back to the motivation, why the government is so interested in digital technologies. Some people say it's because it can enhance their control. Right? I think this is partially also the motivation. But definitely not the only motivation. So I agree. Some of the technologies allow and strengthen the government control. Yeah.
What percentage do you estimate of that 45.5 trillion would be on surveillance?
That I cannot have a good answer to. Yeah. Okay. So now for this project, indeed, we wanted to better understand the effect of policies. Okay. So what I shared with you is more, based on maybe some sort of research, but mostly journalistic accounts. But we wanted to really understand, more. So that's why, while we are seeing all these rosy pictures, right, about how these policies are taking effect, we also noticed, some concerns that the government started to voice. Okay. So one thing, for example, is this employment issue. The government did issue these reports, but you have to look very closely to find them, meaning this is definitely not the priority. However, you do see the concerns about the fact that in digital industries, you need people that are much better educated. Okay. In the non-digital economy, you have people who are, high school and less. But in digital economies, you need a much higher percentage of college and above educated employees. Now, what does that mean? It means the more you adopt digital technologies, the more you have to lay off low educated people. Right? That's such a direct inference from this, but that's not something the government will explicitly say, or it's not something that I will say even companies will explicitly discuss. But we feel this is probably going to have an impact on whether and to what extent companies will invest in these digital technologies.
Can it be opposite? Because if you look at these numbers, right, there were a few people in the younger generation who haven't finished middle school, right?
Right.
So basically, because education has been improving, right? There's a shortage of labor. That's why companies need to go this route. Right?
Right. So the point is, overall, because the education has improved, there should be a higher demand for digital technology. It's true, but again, it's in the long term. Okay? We're talking about government officials whose job depends on the short-term performance of their region. And that's why we feel they have to be concerned with short-term unemployment. So, okay, so indeed, as I said, we read some concerns about how this digital technology could cause structural unemployment, meaning some people, especially the socially disadvantaged groups, will have to suffer more from this than others. So that's why, in terms of our theory or our argument, we wanted to point out that there are these conflicting institutional pressures that operate in China that the government had to face and corporations also have to face. So one of them is, of course, this policy pressure. All these policy documents are being issued, almost every day. So the government has very clear KPIs. They need to implement these strategies. But at the same time, the same government officials are also evaluated by whether they can keep the social stability in their region. Okay, and unemployment could very well threaten that social stability. So, for example, the laid-off people could go on strike. Right? They could visit the government officials and share their complaints, and all those things will be recorded as kind of a lack of social stability in their region, which threaten their government officials' jobs as well. So we feel both pressures are going on at the same time. Now, so I already talked about top government leaders. So again, coming back to my fragmented view, fragmentation comes from these multiple goals. So we feel for the top leaders, for example, the province head or the party secretary of the province, they have to balance these multiple goals: digital transformation as well as social stability. And then if you look at the government bureaucracy, you realize different departments are pushing for different goals. So this Ministry of Industry and Information Technology is the one who is pushing for the digital transformation. The Ministry of Civil Affairs very much concerned about unemployment and social stability. So we feel from the company's point of view, they are approached by government officials from these different departments, and they feel the conflict even more than the government officials. Now, organizational decoupling, I wanted to say, within the government, sometimes you see the means kind of decoupled from the ends. The ends being, for example, in China, ever since 2012, there is this very explicit goal of harmonious society. We need to keep the harmony of our society, but very little has many government officials thought about the impact of digital technologies on harmony. So there we see some decoupling between the means and the end, and then decoupling between the announcement of policy and implementation. Many government officials are satisfied, despite KPI, but they're satisfied with just announcing the policies or pushing the companies a little bit, to show that they're doing it. But they're not really concerned about whether companies can integrate the technologies well into, as Kathy mentioned, whether they're doing it in a systematic way, where they're just simply having several robots or they're actually transforming the production process. So we feel there's a decoupling there. And then for companies, seeing that the government is conflicted or having these multiple objectives, they also understand, the urgency. Right? Maybe or the lack of urgency to do this. Okay, so here to add, for those of you who are less familiar with the Chinese context, the government can influence firms in multiple ways. So indeed, for example, the coercive way, meaning the government can provide subsidies, can give preferential treatment, so that firms feel this coercion, right, when they combine with government policies. And then normative, as I mentioned, especially for private companies. Private companies for a long time lack legitimacy in China, because China has been for a long while the planned economy, and private ownership was not viewed in a very positive way. So compliance with the government actually allows these private companies to gain more legitimacy. If they are able to be awarded by the government some sort of plaque, exemplary in digital transformation, it enhances the legitimacy and helps a lot in terms of getting subsidies and other preferential treatment. And then the government officials visit regularly, the companies or invite these corporate executives to meet with them in their offices. So all of this helps to channel, the pressure to help, corporate executives, understand the priorities of the government officials. And then inside the organizations, Chinese organizations, there are these important functions that ensure alignment of objectives between the companies and the government. So party secretaries play a very important role in terms of guiding, right, strategic decision making to be aligned with government objectives. And labor unions, if there's a layoff, before that happens, labor union leaders have long ago, let the government officials know. So these positions help, alignment. Okay, so based on that, here's our main hypothesis. We believe the policies will indeed have a positive effect. The more policies, the more likely companies should engage in digital transformation. But at the same time, we also believe, if there's a high level of unemployment, then you will see that these firms will be less likely to engage in corporate digitalization. So these are our main hypotheses, kind of outlining the conflicting pressures. And then we think about, how exactly do these government pressures influence firms? Now we believe, through several different ways. For example, the government probably will have a target. Okay, when it comes to digital policies, it probably wanted some companies that can show the biggest change, a change after adoption of the digital technologies. The government probably would prefer those companies to do this first, because once we can have a demo effect, right, other companies will be more likely to follow suit. And also the government is probably going to focus on companies that in their objectives already have, this goal of implementing government policies. So, I mean, state-owned companies, and they should have a very explicit goal of, listening to the government. We also believe resource dependence plays a role. That is, if a company is very dependent on the government, then it's likely to implement the government objective more, because otherwise it loses that resource provision. Yeah.
I'm curious if you could comment on maybe the counterfactual of the lack of government policy, especially on private firms. When you think about SCCEI, right, they probably will adopt this kind of transformation anyways. So how do you think about, especially on the hypothesis 2, right? So if I were this company, I would still want to, adopt those technology. It would still have an impact on unemployment. So how do we think about it?
So there, we believe indeed. So I just talked about the policy pressure. When it comes to unemployment pressure, our thinking is this: the government is going to monitor companies more closely, those companies more closely, if the government feels they are likely to lay off people as a result of the digital technology. So the government is going to selectively monitor companies. So for example, private companies, we do believe, despite the example of SCCEI, we believe private companies will actually be more closely monitored because they are going to lay off people. Now, state-owned companies in China, like state-owned companies in other places, are much less likely to lay off people because the government would not allow that, right? So as a result, we feel in regions where there's higher unemployment pressure, the local government is going to watch more closely, or is going to push less the private companies to digitalize, because they understand, right? Private companies, have a very strong survival need. If they adopt the technology, it's because they want to save on labor costs, which means they are going to lay off people. Otherwise, what's the point of using these digital technologies? So as a result, we feel the government officials, knowing that this is what the private companies are going to do, will actually not want the private companies to adopt digital technologies. So either maybe pressuring them less, or actually talking to them, you should not do this. Now, how then do those officials get their KPIs, right? We feel they probably are going to pressure the state-owned companies in their region to do more of the digital transformation, because the state-owned companies will not lay off people even after the opportunity.
We always, right? So I don't know if I see my paper, the next robots in China.
Yes,
Right, so
I read
we
the
have
robot paper.
We have like hypothesis similar to yours, except there's one about the market force, right? So in that paper we found it is, we have a big survey actually, 2,000 firms in China. Actually, so, manufacturing firms, we found that because they cannot find enough workers, so they have to use robot or machinery to replace those tasks, right?
Yes.
Labor. So because of the shortage of labor, declining population in China, is labor force, rising wages.
Yes.
So companies are forced to use robots. So
Yes.
not that they don't
because
want
of
to
the
buy.
government-
There's no unemployment to start with, right?
Yes.
It's a
Yes.
shortage of labor.
Right, so that's a very good point. Indeed, later on, I'll share with you some findings that we did not initially anticipate. So indeed, because private companies are probably more sensitive to the market influence. So their motivation, right, the reason they adopt might not be just because of the government did this, but other reasons as well. But so indeed, so we thought about what kinds of companies are more likely to be influenced by these two different pressures. And we feel probably we're going to see different impacts, on these companies. So this one, we believe, state-owned companies, we should see a stronger effect of policies because state-owned companies are expected to comply with government policies even more. So maybe the effect should be stronger there. But when there's high unemployment pressure, we feel the private companies will be withheld more. So that weaker on SOEs, meaning stronger on private firms. Meaning, if we believe unemployment pressure is going to stop companies from adopting, then this effect should be stronger on private companies. Yes, Eric.
Yeah, well, so when you talk about the digital policies here, are you simply look at the binary adoption of this policy on a simple count, or you look deeper, actually look at the content of the policies here?
A very good question. So let me go to, let me mention that. So our measurement, we look at both. So our dependent variable, we actually experimented with many different outcomes. First, we started with the discussion, because in the annual report, there's a section where they talk about their corporate strategies, right? So we did a text analysis, and then we feel in China, sometimes you see this decoupling between what they say, what companies want to do, and how much money they actually spend. So we decided to look at the actual money spent. So today I'm going to present to you the results using that dependent variable. So our dependent variable is actually the section in their annual reports where we report how much investment they made in these smart factories or these digital projects in their production process. So we're really looking at the hardcore of the digital transformation, not the administrative functions or marketing, HR, but rather the production process. So, and we tried both, whether they invest, dummy, as well as the actual amount of money spent in this. Okay, so that's one kind of moderator, that is the state ownership. We also feel low education, because this is going to be the people impacted most by digital transformation. They're going to be laid off. So we believe, from the policy pressure point of view, the officials probably would like to target companies with a lot of low education employees, because that's where digital technologies will make most sense, right? They are going to replace repetitive labor, low education labor, and they're going to improve labor efficiency that way. So we feel this is going to be the targeting. If government officials are interested in digital transformation, they probably will push these companies with more low level, low education employees more. Okay. However, with the unemployment pressure, we feel it should be the opposite. That is, companies with a lot of low level people will lay off people. After adoption of the technology. So if the unemployment pressure is high, the government probably is going to avoid these companies, pushing other companies to digitalize, but not this type of companies. And then the third one we feel is about subsidies. So we think of subsidies, by the way, subsidies here are not specific to digital transformation. So any kind of subsidies. In China, a lot of subsidies are indeed related to R&D, R&D, environment, or nowadays chips, and digital transformation, of course. So we feel subsidies serve the function of kind of resource dependence. So if a company receives a lot of subsidies from the government, it feels more pressured, obligated to complying with the government, because not doing that will lead to the withdrawal of the subsidies. So we feel if a company has a lot of subsidies, they're going to be more eager to comply with digital policies. And if the local government has higher ongoing pressure, meaning not wanting to do digital that much, they should also do less. Okay, so they should just go with the government priorities. Okay, so that's the hypothesis. Our sample is manufacturing companies, so publicly listed manufacturing companies. We have more than about 550 unique firms in our data and 11 years of data. We picked the year 2009 because the first major kind of digital policy from the central government was issued in the year 2006. And then right after that, we had the 2008 financial crisis. So digital transformation was stopped a little bit. So that's why we decided to start from 2009, when we can observe really companies responding to the government policy. We stopped in the year 2019 to avoid the contamination from the COVID. Okay, so that's the timeline. Now some descriptives. So in our sample, we have 548. About 1/3 of them invested in the smart factories. So indeed, here we're talking about the hardcore, right, digital transformation of the production process, and the percentage is much lower than what we saw earlier, which probably includes all kinds of HR records, administrative, marketing, right? So here we have about 1/3 of the company, but in terms of the firm year, right, 11 years, we can say the probability of a firm investing in a smart factory is about 9.9%. Okay, so this is kind of the average based on our data. Now, for those companies that have actually invested in smart factories, the average amount of money, it's not a lot, 3.6 million, and the max, there could be a big variation. Okay, so this is how we coded we receive our data. It's based on CSNR, database for publicly listed companies in China. And we look at this item, digital transformation enterprise project under construction. Okay, so companies report this, RMB each year. Okay. So here's some examples. So they not only will report the amount of money, they also describe the kind of projects that they invested. So you will see this is mainly about smart manufacturing. Yes.
So Rose?
Yeah.
It's really interesting. One of the things that I was thinking about was what the alternative strategic choice is. So the companies that aren't investing in digital transformation, in response to the increased competitive pressures and higher wages, oversupply manufacturing, are they tending to, can you observe in the data that they're going to lower cost countries in Southeast Asia or on the African continent? So it'd be interesting to see what's that alternative choice to respond to the pressures.
Right, that's a very good question. Indeed, in our model, we try to, so that's a control, right? But we recognize the market pressure is also a potential driving force. So we try to control for the industry level, kind of, what other companies in the same industry is doing to see whether that had an impact. Indeed, I think as a response to this, if they're not able to lay off people, but they still want to benefit from the efficiency, maybe they will choose to expand in other places. I really like this because I can see that in some of the companies we interview. So for example, Haidilao is a hot pot restaurant chain. You wouldn't believe a restaurant chain could be so rich, right? It's a publicly listed company. And when we ask them, if you adopt, and they adopted smart kitchen and smart manufacturing, we ask them, how do you deal with the laid off people? And they say, no, we never lay off people. Actually, it's part of our corporate culture. We never lay off people, and that's how we keep people. And we don't think it's a problem for us because we expand so much. Okay, so I think it's true for private companies they do have an alternative. In other words, if they're actively expanding, they do have a way to deal with these extra labor force. Yes.
Yeah, because the other thing I was thinking about was like Eric Brynjolfsson and all of his co-authors work on kind of complementary investments that have to be made to get the full advantage out of adopting information technologies. And so maybe some of the firms are able to make those complementary investments, reorganize the
Yes.
systems,
Mm.
whereas others aren't. And so then they've got to go with the like expand to a lower cost country approach.
Yes, yes. I think paradoxically, the state-owned companies in China are probably more versatile in this than private companies because they are not allowed to lay off. They do try many different ways to, retrain people, put them in other places, think about how to, use the complementary. But private firms, because they're much more short-term oriented, sometimes they don't want to deal with that. That's why Haidilao is always treated as an exception. The reason it's so well known and promulgated, it's because it's an outlier. It's not a typical private company. Yeah. Okay. So that's our dependent variable, that is the investment. And then our independent variable, we coded policies from this 北大法宝. Okay, the PKU law, this collects all the policies and government regulations, and we use some keywords. We did manual coding and have intercoder reliability, very acceptable. So we counted the number of basically policies, regulations that are, in different provinces. And then the other interesting variable, unemployment, as you know, National Bureau of Statistics probably doesn't always report the precise unemployment statistics. Yes. Oh, okay. Wow. Okay. So let me go quick. So there, and that's probably why we did not find a significant effect of unemployment level. And later on, we decided to use the change in unemployment level because we feel maybe, what the government local officials are mostly concerned and what will influence their KPI is whether the unemployment level has changed over time, has increased over time. So we decided to use whether there's a change. And as a result, it has a very strong, effect. We also use some other measures like the percentage of people claiming unemployment insurance and all that. So different measures show very robust results. So let me quickly, okay, by the way, this is the unemployment level. So the darker the higher the unemployment level. But then the variable we use is actually the change in unemployment level. So here, the darker again is there has been more years when the local government experienced an increase in unemployment level. So for example, Beijing has a quite low unemployment level, but for 5 years out of the 11 that we studied, it has experienced an increase in unemployment level. So as a result, it's darker in color. Okay, so given the time, we did have a lot of controls, firm level, leaders level, and environment level. So very, very detailed controls. And indeed, so here, let me briefly report the finding. We find policies have a very strong effect only on the dummy variable. So whether the company invests in smart factories, but it does not have a strong effect, significant effect, which is my next table, on the investment amount. So this gives us some indication that, as a response to the government policies, companies feel they can just show that they invested, but not maybe keeping it up. Okay, so that's about the government policy. And then, we do find policies have a stronger effect on companies with lower level education, employees, as we hypothesized, this is the target. Also, companies that have more subsidies, but we don't see a significant effect for state-owned companies. So maybe the private companies, they also want to comply with government policies for legitimacy benefits. So we have that result. And then unemployment has a very strong effect, both on the likelihood, whether they companies invest, as well as the amount of investment. And the significant interaction there is with state-owned companies. So indeed, when unemployment level has increased, local government officials would prefer state-owned companies to engage in digital transformation, but not private companies. Okay, so that's the finding. So I will go Yeah, I just described the findings here. Limitations, of course, I feel we only look at one country, and our interest is indeed to compare, because as I mentioned in the beginning, this is across the globe. National governments are all interested in digitalization and have all passed policies, and we want to understand, whether policies, work, or in which way they work. And then, we recognize the lack of qualitative research. So indeed, have to learn from Kathy how to do more qualitative research to better understand what the government is thinking and what the corporate executives are thinking when they show this pattern of digital adoption. Okay, so contributions. We feel our study offers a more nuanced view and a more rigorous test of the effect of government policies in this domain of digital transformation. We also show how important this pressure from unemployment is, even though it's not explicitly discussed. We can clearly see that this is on the mind of the government, and how it influenced digital adoption. We think we also shed light on how this multiple goals of the state can influence policy implementation. So we hope from now on, people who study policy implementation will not just be looking at that specific policy, but rather to understand the potential unintended consequence of the policy, and so that you can better understand the other goals of the state. And then for the firm level finding, we feel our research helps to better understand how firms respond to conflicting institutional pressures. Okay, if you are interested in different aspects of our project, I want to quickly mention, in addition to this policy focused piece, we are also interested in family businesses. So how family businesses respond to digital transformation. So I've some of the work is already written. So if you're interested in the private sector part, we can talk about how family businesses in China respond to corporate digital transformation. Thank you very much.
Couple minutes for questions. Any further questions?
Maybe if you go back to the findings slide, so to refresh us. Back.
The table you want to see.
No, the one that's on,
the one that I listed our findings.
just before limitations,
Yes.
right there.
In the interim, can I just ask a quick question about terminology? So is there a difference between automation and, I missed the first half of the talk, so excuse me if you already talked. So what's the difference between automation and digital transformation? Is there a particular reason you take this?
Yes, so the dependent variable is indeed more focused on the construction of smart factories. So from that point of view, it is automation, but maybe it's broader than if you're thinking about simply automation through robots. Right? It's broader than just the use of certain technologies, but rather the use of a series of different things in order to completely change the production process. Mm-hmm. So it could include blockchain, automation, cloud computing. So a lot of things, digital technologies that can automate the whole process. Mm-hmm.
No, we're just gonna process it.
Yeah, so far this is a consistent findings that I'm reporting to you here. I will say indeed, compare with my hypothesis earlier on, we did not find that unemployment pressure will influence the companies with lower level education people more, in terms of constraining them more. We actually find a slight positive interaction there, meaning maybe the private companies with a lot of low level people felt they can benefit from using digital technologies. So despite the unemployment pressure and the government's reluctance whether to use digital technologies. They still would like to use some. So
No, one complaint about China's unemployment numbers that it doesn't change much.
yes,
So our stays at the same level. It's not really unemployment, it's called registered unemployment rates. Basically,
indeed. So when we use unemployment level, which is between 4% and 5%, we were not able to see any significant result. However, when we use the change, as a dummy variable, this is how I feel sometimes in Chinese data. I feel even though there's some adjustment, okay, some calibration, but dummy variables are more effective than continuous variables, meaning still it reflects some trend, okay, and that's why I feel it's more trustworthy to think about the change, because it's the change that's exerting pressure on the government officials. So for example, in some of our provinces, the unemployment level is quite high, but the officials were not very concerned because it stayed at that level. So they don't feel any pressure. But if they used to be, quite low and then it starts to increase, that's when they will feel the pressure, and that's when they will probably, tell the companies not to adopt digital technologies.
yeah, when we wrote the paper on the REST robot, so we explained that it's the labor shortage or REST wave that drives companies to use robot, not the other way around, right? But the referees asked the question, do Chinese worry about unemployment in China? So we were curious, actually. We checked the so-called work value survey.
Yeah.
It's not really your colleagues thing, it's a sociologist reconstructing view. And Chinese are really different from all other nations.
Right, they don't worry about it.
They don't worry about it at all.
Yeah.
So all Chinese are so enthusiastic about adopting new technologies.
Yeah.
Nobody worries about unemployment.
Yes.
So that's where China is so different from all other countries.
Right.
So,
However, so we also did interviews, and this is something very interesting I want to share. Whenever we interview people from, these Ministry of Technology, IT, when we explicitly ask them about unemployment, they will say yes, just like Hongbin said, no, we don't worry about that. China is growing so fast. We will absorb this labor very easily. So they don't worry about it. But when we talk with people from Ministry of Civil Affairs, they have a lot of worries. They talk about the increased unemployment level. They talk, why do we now use, in China, the highway? It used to be, we have a lot of people there, right? Charging, and now people are gone. It's all automated. And Ministry of Civil Affairs people will say, why is that? We need to provide employment. Why are we doing all this? They are very, very concerned. So, and we feel they are exerting separate pressures on companies, and then to the very top level of the government, they are worried, okay, because they have these multiple KPIs. They do need to show digital transformation, but they also need to show social stability. So we feel the conflicting pressures really are accentuated at the very top, and that's why we feel corporations they feel the heat, and that's why they can change or balance their investment.
it will be very interesting to compare China to other countries with different values, right? So for the France, maybe more difficult. It's more, right? They worry more about employment.
Yes. So indeed, we feel, even though this is Chinese context, we feel the pressures are actually very relevant to governments across the world, and we're curious to learn, how much unemployment pressure could play a role in different countries. Yes.
Yeah. How do you define SOE and where the effect of policy and unemployment be different for different kind of SOEs, because there are central SOE or local SOE and different SOEs with different share of the state. So the influence will be different. So
Yes,
do you see?
that's a very good question. In fact, so first of all, the definition is whether the ultimate controller is the state asset control, this organization. So that's how we define SOE. But to answer your question, indeed, there's a big difference between central government-owned SAE and local government-owned SAE. In fact, the paper is already under review. We're comparing the two types of SOEs in their digital transformation. And to give you the short summary of the results, we find the central SOEs responded much more to the central government, to these digital policies, but the local SOEs actually do not. And the reason they do not is because they can be protected by local governments, for not doing it. Okay, so when they see the risk or they don't see some immediate benefit, they do not want to do it. So in fact, another project of ours is looking at how private ownership is actually, because China has done a lot of this mixed ownership reform. Private ownership, when they are minority shareholder in these state-owned companies, they're more likely to push for digital transformation because they want to try it out, in a stable setting, and then apply it in their own, private companies. So I will say not all state-owned companies, as you said, have the incentive, to do this, and that's why we see central, SOEs do more, and that's why we see, when private ownership is involved, these companies actually do more. Yes.
So Rose, it's really interesting. I like the overall story about the kind of institutional conflicts across the kind of fragmentation view. I'd be curious to look at whether the performance of the firms benefits. Is this sort of is the government right in sort of pushing firms that might be kind of lagging behind to start to adopt these digital technologies? Or is this kind of overinvestment just to do sort of the myth and ceremony of complying,
Yes.
where it's not actually benefiting the company's performance?
Right. I will do that. Thank you for that suggestion. Indeed, I think, when we interview these companies, corporate executives, especially from state-owned companies, always say, the government really has a vision. They believe, okay. One of them is coming to INSEAD for training. I will be their program director, and they specifically asked for digital transformation as the theme of the training program. And they said, the government really has a vision. We are more interested in the short term, but the government wants us to, think about the future. And so I think very likely, maybe the short-term performance will not benefit, but maybe in the long run, right? Infrastructures are built or something. Yes. Yeah.
The key assumption here is the digital transformation will somewhat push the unemployment. So I wonder if in your data you can examine whether or not this assumption holds by comparing the number of employment on the firms that in your data before they adopt the digital transformation and after. So maybe it's the case that the firms who adopt digital transformation is growing and they're hiring more after they make their firm more efficient.
Yes. So thank you. I will make a note of it and really look at the concepts. But thank you for the question. That's why the way I look at unemployment is not just I would say it's not just a market phenomena or just not just a real threat. That's why, again, influenced by my Stanford professors, I tend to see it as an institutional pressure, because the very fact that the unemployment level has changed a bit can cause concerns to the government officials, and they feel this is something that's going to threaten their career. Okay, whether this is something that's actually substantial, whether digital transformation will actually worsen it is unknown, as you said, right? It is an assumption, but to them, they already feel the pressure and they are going to change their behavior. So that's why I feel it's very institutional. It's not just to use the word real market pressure.
Okay, so for the interest time, I have to go here.
Okay.
Let's give Rose a